Welcome back, you guys. Today I'm going to show you how to make this massive Cobra cake. So this cake is actually inspired by Taylor Swift, who's really taken the whole snake theme from social media and turned it into a strength. I so admire her, I'm a huge fan, and I'm seeing her this summer, so she really inspired me to make this cake. I used two 12-inch chocolate marbled cake layers to create the body of the snake, and I created the tail and the head using some Rice Krispie treats. I also used a large wooden dowel to make sure that the snake's neck was nice and supported. I began this massive cake process by starting with the Rice Krispie treats, which need time to set, so it's important that you make them first. I followed the instructions on the Rice Krispie box to make these, so these are just standard Rice Krispie treats. I read online that sometimes it's better to omit the butter, but after doing a bunch of research, people had mixed reviews, so I just made some classic Rice Krispie treats to make sure that they tasted great. I melted butter and then I added in the marshmallows and melted those down as well. And then I added the entire box of Rice Krispie treats. The recipe calls for slightly less, but you want these Rice Krispies to be really nice and firm, so you're going to add in a bit more cereal than you would if you were making classic Rice Krispie treats. I ended up using an entire bag of marshmallows and an entire box of cereal. So these weren't quite as sticky as the standard Rice Krispies, but you can see that they're still sticking together and they're going to be perfect for molding. Before I started molding, I cut a hole in my cake board so that I could insert my dowel into it and make sure that my snake neck was really secure. Next, I sprayed my hands with some nonstick cooking spray. You could also use butter or a bit of shortening. And I then began to add my Rice Krispie treats up my dowel. So at first I thought I could assemble this and kind of create the shape while it was vertical, but I found that it was much easier to do this just by taking it out of the board and rolling it flat, because you want to get these really nice and compact so they can keep their shape. Next, I began to create kind of an S shape in the neck, which sounds silly, but I wanted it to look like the cobra was really about to strike, and I then also shaped out the mouth. I let this chill in the freezer for about an hour before adding it to my cake board. I then began to build around the base of the neck to continue the body of the snake towards where my cake layers would eventually be. Next, I began to shape my snake's tail. So this is easiest to do with Rice Krispies because when you trim cake layers to be this thin, they can be super delicate. So it's a lot easier making the final bit of the tail with Rice Krispies. Next, I coated the Rice Krispie treat with some white chocolate. And white chocolate works really well because it gets in all those nooks and crannies. And it also hardens, which makes it much easier to add fondant onto the Rice Krispie treats. So once I had covered my tail and my cobra head fully in white chocolate, I began to work on the rest of the snake's body. So I began by removing my massive 12-inch cake layers from my cake pan. I baked them with a flour nail in the center just to help them bake more quickly. I then flipped it over and removed the center using about a 4.5-inch circle cutter. I cut this ring in half, and I set one portion of it aside, and I used the other portion to align with my snake tail. It took me a while to get this positioned in the right angle to kind of have the snake body flowing naturally. I had to trim the sides at some different angles and reposition things a couple times before I got it just right. Then I began to trim these cake layers to create kind of the curved sides of the snake's body. So I trimmed a little bit from the top and a bit from the bottom as well. I used one more half from my other cake layer to connect this body to the head, and I then added some buttercream on top of the cake to begin to crumb coat it. Normally I chill my cake layers before I add a crumb coat, but in this situation, since the cake is so large, it's not really possible to chill them once they're cut. So I was really careful as I did this. I had a really gentle touch and just very slowly worked the frosting down the sides of the cake. I also made sure to kind of run the buttercream over the bits of white chocolate just to blend everything together. I then used an acetate sheet to get a smoother finish since this cake has curved sides. I also ended up actually adding some buttercream on top of the white chocolate just because when it dried it wasn't super smooth and I wanted the finish to be a bit smoother before I added on fondant. To give this cake an amazing texture and really make it look like snakeskin, I bought this silicone mat on Amazon, and it has an amazing texture. I've included the link in the video description below. So I added some cornstarch to my mat, and I then rolled the fondant directly onto it before I added each section to my cake. So you can't really see from this distance before I colored it, but it really had such an amazing look. So I added it in pretty small sections just because I couldn't roll out the fondant pieces much larger due to the size of my mat. So I started in the center of the cake and kind of worked my way out to the tail and then up to the head. So this took a few different pieces of fondant. I think it ended up being about 5 pieces, and then of course several for the head. As you guys know, I really don't work with fondant very often because I'm not super fond of the taste, but it was kind of unavoidable with this cake. I really wanted that beautiful texture, and it's also good to push my limits and work with something that I'm not super comfortable with. To fill in any areas where the fondant seams come together, I made a paste out of some fondant and water, and I just kind of went over it to seal the two together. And then it was time to add fondant to the face. So this part was a little bit trickier, and I started by adding fondant to kind of the fans of the cobra head. This just seemed like the natural starting point for me. So I covered those and pressed them gently over the edge, and then I added on the paneling to the cobra's stomach. I just used the edge of my offset spatula to create these lines. I gently worked it to the side of the neck to meet where the other piece of fondant was, and then I added a piece of textured fondant over the top of the cobra's head. So this part was also a little bit tricky, and I just slowly worked it around the head. Once I felt like it was in a good spot, I trimmed away any excess using a small knife. And once I had gotten rid of all of those extra little bits, I very carefully pressed the fondant into the cobra's mouth. So I trimmed away the excess and used my knife to kind of push it inside of the mouth. And as I did this, the jaw piece came a little bit loose, so I just kind of re-secured it by adding a little bit of pressure and then folded over any of those extra bits really into the mouth. Next, I made some little holes for the cobra's eyes, and then it was time to color it. So I can't believe it, but this is actually my first time ever using an airbrush. I've always wanted one, I finally got one, and so I'm still definitely getting the hang of it, but luckily this was a super forgiving cake. Cobras do actually have spots on them, so the areas where I got a little bit too close with my airbrush almost look like they're intentional spots. Once I had added on all of my brown food coloring to coat the cake, I added on a second layer of gold coloring. And then all I had to do was add on the tongue, the fangs, and of course the eyes. Somehow my cobra ended up looking really happy. I think it's just the shape of its mouth, but this is like the least menacing cobra I've ever seen. Despite my cobra's smile, I really love how this cake turned out. I love the flow of its body and all of its beautiful texture. So the last thing we need to do is just cut into this cake and do a little taste test. So I'm using a red knife just because I always think of red lipstick when I think of Taylor Swift. And here we have it. We have the beautiful marbling of our chocolate cake layers and lots of that delicious buttercream. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this Taylor Swift inspired cobra cake as much as I enjoyed making it. If you haven't already, be sure to click the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.